Welcome, Josh. Um, so
Thank you.
for our listeners, I'm here with my buddy Josh Wolk, um, and uh, I'll give a little background of Josh's work, and then Josh, maybe you can add if I'm missing anything. But
Okay.
Josh is a Feldenkrais trainer and practitioner. So that means he works with people individually and in a group setting. And another point of intersection that Josh and I have is we're both practitioners of Aikido, although Josh is what Dan are you?
I withdrew from any Don granting
Okay.
organization about 20 years ago, but I was a fifth Don then.
Okay.
Uh,
So for folks who don't know, that's quite senior. And Josh had the wonderful privilege of being a live-in apprentice with a wonderful teacher, Chiba Sensei. Um, but in any case, a mutual friend of ours introduced us and said, "Hey, you guys should talk." And I went to Josh for some private sessions, and then very quickly we just became buddies. And we like to go for these walks around the city and around the park and just talk about intersections in our work. And so this talk is going to be very much that. You can imagine us walking around Central Park or perhaps sitting on a park bench. And uh, there are a couple topics that we may touch on, but I do want to let listeners know that we are gonna wander a bit. So this is not sort of a how-to video or something like that. Um, so Josh, welcome.
Thank you. And just one sort of correction. In the Feldenkrais world, it's a very tiny little world, but it is governed by a thing called the Feldenkrais Guild. And so the term trainer is a
You're not a
particular
trainer. Yeah.
title. And my penchant to not involve myself in a lot, like same reason why I withdrew from any sort of Don rank granting organizations. I also haven't tried to climb the ladder in the Feldenkrais world either. I've been teaching people for 30 years, but the term trainer is actually it means something in the community, and that's not, I don't have that title. So
Understood. Yeah, and thanks for
just
clearing
to be
that
clear.
out. It's interesting. I had a suspicion about that, and yeah, to become it's it's not becoming a teacher in Feldenkrais, but to become a trainer is just years and years and so many hoops that you have to jump through. And that
Yeah,
being
the years,
said,
no problem.
Josh is
Years
quite
wise,
senior.
yeah, okay, right, yeah.
Yeah,
Years wise, I was eligible, I don't know, 15 years ago or so.
yeah,
But hoops wise,
many hoops. Yeah.
I
So,
haven't, I haven't, yeah.
and sorry to cut you off. So, I'll throw a couple pebbles out, and then we'll see where we go.
Okay.
Right before we hopped on, Josh and I were talking about the kind of the effect of learning how to calm down your nervous system, the effect on anything that we're learning, the effect on just being in the world, dealing with trauma. Um, so that I would say that's one thread that perhaps we'll explore a bit. And then the other point of interest that Josh and I talk about very often is, what is it that precipitates sort of an aha experience for an individual or a learning moment? So yeah, so
Oh
why
yeah,
don't you just jump on?
I just thought of a fun story about aha. So when we get to that, I've got a juicy one. Another area of overlap that I think is maybe worth mentioning is that, my apprenticeship with the Aikido master, which is a long time ago now, he was also a Zen priest, and I've spent a lot of time on the Zen cushion, and also doing meditation of other kinds for many decades now. Um, but you're also a serious Zen practitioner, and I think that's another place where we overlap and have a lot to talk about. So just to throw that out there.
Yeah, as well as, I mean, my understanding is you haven't studied NLP or Ericksonian hypnotherapy directly so much, but you've been an avid sponge and have been hanging around with some quite prominent people, right?
Yeah, and my first introduction to Erickson was when maybe I was 20, and so I've been a big Erickson follower for a long time without ever having formally trained in any way, as you point out. So yes.
So, I'll say a little bit about this idea of calming the nervous system down, a little bit about what I
Yeah.
mean by that. Um, for me, there's the sort of the intellectual or sort of physiological framework that we can talk about. Okay, what happens when you calm down? And then there's the experience of that. And I think what happened with me is over the years, practicing Aikido, practicing trance or Ericksonian hypnotherapy, certainly practicing Zen, I would notice that I would go into a certain state of mind. I'd usually notice it once I was there. It's kind of like, oh, wow, I'm in a very different place than I was maybe 10 minutes ago when I walked into the dojo or when I walked into a room. And over time, I started connecting the dots of some of the impact of that state of mind. That when I was really calm, I would feel capable of taking on challenges or things that perhaps I wasn't usually capable of taking on. Certainly, we could look at things like regulating your breathing, slowing the breathing down, settling into the body, and allowing your musculature to relax a bit. And the other setting where I would notice that is when I would be doing a Feldenkrais lesson, whether it's an ATM, which is a group structure for people who don't know, or kind of hands-on work. I'd be on the table and all of a sudden I'd realize like, oh my gosh, I'm very relaxed. I'm not falling asleep necessarily, but I'm very relaxed and new insights might start to emerge then. So
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that one learns by doing something like meditation or by doing Feldenkrais work and other things is that states that we usually associate with each other don't necessarily have to be associated. So, for instance, calm with sleepiness, right? So we often associate a kind of a quiet in the nervous system with a drowsy quality. And of course, anybody who's spent any time on the meditation cushion knows that that drowsy quality can certainly come into it. But you can also arrive at these moments where there's this sort of deep calm, but without any trace of tiredness or drowsiness at all. And for many people, that's an unusual experience. This is right, because those two things are usually so deeply associated that sort of finding a way to differentiate them can be tricky. And I think to some extent that's exactly what you're talking about. It also puts in mind of this important distinction between the different modes of the nervous functioning of something that I don't know how deeply we want to get into it, but the autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system, which have everything to do with whether you're relaxed or whether you're amped up. So I could do a little quick intro to that for people who maybe don't know, but that's, it's a little technical and I don't know if that's how we want to use our time. Totally up to you.
Okay. Maybe we can sprinkle that in. As you were talking about that, I was reminded of a friend of yours, Donna Ray. And Donna Ray was she is a Feldenkrais trainer, right?
Yeah.
And she was one of the first people that drew my attention in a certain way to the calming of the nervous system and some of the cognitive effects of that. And I think it's because she's very much into the work of Daniel Siegel, who's a neuroscientist. And so in any case, she explained to me that she said, yeah, when you calm down, the part of your brain that tends to be very judgmental, self-critical, quiets down. And whether, what helped me connect the dots was, she said, it could happen in Feldenkrais, it can happen in meditation, it can happen with a glass of wine, that part of your brain quiets down. And that's why people tend to feel a little bit more willing to expand and connect with the world in places where they might not usually.
Yeah. And I think, there's something very interesting, so there's what happens neurologically when you calm down, which is a big thing. And then there's also sort of this more recent stuff that neuroscientists have started to look into, having to do with neuroplasticity, right? So there's different modes. I mean, this is a very general statement, but there's different modes of the brain. And to sort of put it in a really blunt way, one mode is sort of the mode where you just do what you already know how to do, right? You're functioning in a way that you've got all those programs well written into your nervous system, right?
You're on default.
And then that's not a very highly plastic state of the brain. And then you have this other mode, or it's not just like a binary, like one mode or the other, but there are other modes. And in fact, there's certain neuromodulators and neurotransmitters that seem to be associated with a mode that your brain can go into where it's ready to make new connections. So that's a much more highly plastic mode of the brain. And that mode comes in under interesting circumstances. And, anybody who spends time watching the Huberman podcast, he gets into this kind of stuff to some extent. It's super interesting, being confused. If you're confused, your brain is triggered to emit these chemicals that just like create plastic. It's like, okay, we're confused. That means there's something we have to figure out. That means new connections need to be made. And so there's something about the combination of calm, as you're talking about, the sort of quieting of the nervous system, but then also the introduction of some element of newness, of novelty, of confusion, of some problem that needs to be figured out. And there's some sort of magic sauce that almost literally sauce, because it's like these neurotransmitters that seem to create a kind of plastic state for the brain that's really good for learning. And so, but I think calm is a major, major element. And it's the element that most people don't have trouble being confused, right? People maybe avoid situations where they're confused, but people do often have trouble calming down. So I think your idea of talking about the state, the circumstances under which that kind of calm is available, I'm all for it.
Yeah. I think one thing that happens is, I'll just speak of my own experience. If I'm confused, for me, I would say there's two modes that confusion can sort of take. I'm sure there are many, but the first one is like, oh, I'm confused. Well, that's interesting. Like, wait a minute, like, is it this or is it this? Or there's something new here, or I'm seeing something unexpected. And I think that's a very generative type of confusion. I think sometimes we go into confusion, and if there's any question of, is it safe? Then there's a problem. Then it's kind of like hands gripping the side of the pool, right?
100%.
And that's why I think, there needs to be this marriage between the confusion and that sort of calm safety.
Yeah. And in fact, I think it's probably also the case that there's a kind of cyclical nature to that sort of experience. So if you're confused and your safety feels like it's somehow at risk, even just on a social level where you're confused and you're afraid that you're going to screw something up and other people are going to judge you for doing that, for making that mistake, which, I mean, that's a good description of school, right? Mm-hmm. But so like that circumstance is a circumstance that I think, because confusion has this tendency to sort of generate neuroplasticity, and neuroplasticity is all about creating new connections and looking, right? So when you enter that sort of neuroplastic state, and what your response to it is to white knuckle, as you're saying, like hold on to the edge of the pool as tight as you can. Well, it's like you're embedding in your neuroplasticity processing, just this idea that when confusion arises, you must
danger. Yeah.
You must grip, it's danger, and you must grip on. And just like separating calm from tiredness, I think separating confusion from fear, or confusion from a sense of emergency, is a super crucial aspect of learning of any kind. Yeah. And because you can't learn if you're not confused to begin with, right? You always starts with confusion. And if you've just learned to be scared of confusion, and that confusion is a trigger for fear and
danger.
So you can see how that can be a vicious cycle, but there's a virtuous cycle that can be enacted too, where you learn to accept the state of confusion and be calm within it. And I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm thinking of there is an overlap, I think, very much in the way that Feldenkrais is often taught or delivered, and the way that NLP is taught. And I remember in some of my early NLP classes, naturally, I'm in a room with a group of people. I'm relating that to school, where it wasn't always safe. It's like, oh, am I going to be called out by the teacher? Am I going to be tested? And having this experience of both the environment reaffirming again and again, it's okay, it's safe. And me really kind of in a very visceral way saying like, yeah, but is it really safe? Or is the, right, is the hammer going to fall at a certain point? And really kind of keeping that in the back of my mind for a while. But I think part of what alleviated that is, at least in much of the way that NLP is taught, and I believe in Feldenkrais too, you're not looking for a binary relationship of correct and incorrect in any performance of any kind, or you're looking for a distinction of what's the difference between this and this. So when you're exploring differences, there's no right or wrong. There's just difference, right? And I think that can be a really powerful way to create some of that safety.
Yeah, and I think that, that puts me in mind of another subject of conversation that you and I often touch on when we talk, which is sort of the distinction between exactly what you're talking about, these environments where there's a real sort of depth to the feeling of safety and to the feeling of that one can explore in a safe sort of way, and that there isn't really a right. You're not looking for the right way of doing it. You're not trying to somehow mimic or take on somebody else's idea of what the correct thing to do is, but rather you're exploring, right? So there's the distinction between that sort of a state and then these other realms where it's like, so for instance, in Aikido, where you will often find people who they're really just trying to mimic what the teacher is doing. And in fact, that's the whole, that's the class. And there is a right way to do it. And if you don't do it the right way, the teacher may very well yell at you, or you might even get punched in the face, or you don't know what's going to, it's not safe at all. Like it's totally unsafe. And or like even something just like another realm that we talk about that I don't have any experience with at all, really, but that you have a lot of experience with, which is music, where there's a sort of technical mastery, or there's a sort of technical, like, you gotta be able to play your chords and play your scales and know those things backwards and forwards. And you can't just go in there and just do whatever unless you're Keith Jarrett or somebody, the ability to go into that improvisational mode is something that you earn over a long period of time of sort of getting the basics down. So that's a weird tension between this safe environment where sort of anything goes and, you could pee your pants and nobody will make fun of you. And then this other domain where it's like, hey, get your act together and like, put your foot here and, and all this intense stuff. And that's, I think complicated.
I think what's tricky is, I think it's essential for growth that you set up this safe environment. That being said, we also want to have ways that a person can check in and see how they're doing. not about making them wrong, but more like, oh, I'm not wrong, but I'm getting this move wrong. You know, my particular movement is just not the way that it's done. Now, one thing that I found so interesting when I started studying Aikido and in New York Aikikai, where I studied, there's so many different teachers with so many different opinions. And I was coming from a Kung Fu background. So I would see stuff and I just learned to take everything with a grain of salt. You know, because one teacher would come in and say, this is how you do this move. And they were adamant, like, this is this. And I'm like, oh, okay, I better really learn that. And then literally the next day, a different teacher would come and say, no, that's nonsense. It's like this. It's not like this. It's, you know, that drastic a distinction. So I started realizing, okay, there's obviously more truths here, and I'm going to need to figure out a way to learn in that environment. I will say music's a good analogy, because in music, you're either playing the scale or you're not playing that scale.
Right.
For the most part, right? You're either, there's not a lot of gray there.
Right.
So.
Well, I have a story that is very much in line with what you're talking about, that maybe I could take a couple minutes just to tell. I think I've told it to you before, but it might be worth, and it's a little far afield from the beginning topic of calming the nervous system, but I think it's maybe a good one. So, you know, when I was coming up in Aikido, so I started training in Aikido when I was just a kid, and I had this wonderful teacher. She was a Japanese woman who was teaching Japanese at Smith College, and I grew up in Northampton, Massachusetts, where Smith is. And her all-time hero in Aikido was this master, Chiba Sensei, you know, and he was like this. So he was sort of this legendary figure. He was just like someone that you might see someday if you're lucky, you know.
Right.
And she was fantastic. She was about 4'6", you know, she was a tiny little person, but she could just like do these amazing things. And she said, you know, Chiba was her primary. So I sort of grew up with this idea that Chiba, like the way Chiba did it, that's the right way.
That's the right way.
Right. And then, of course, you know, I end up going and I trained with him for many years, and I learned the right way. And there wasn't this thing where you had various teachers like your experience that you're describing, where you sort of have this openness to different things. It was a way where you did it the way Sensei did it, period. And I was a true believer. I was really a true believer in that sense. Of course, all my life, I knew that Chiba had grown up with another Aikido master named Kanai Sensei, who taught out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Kanai Sensei was wonderful. I thought he was a fantastic Aikidoist. Couldn't have been more different style-wise from Chiba, right? And I was convinced that Chiba was the way. And then over the years, training with Chiba and sort of hearing the story, they came up together since like preschool, they were together. And at a certain point, I was like, oh, you know, in Japan, everything's very rank oriented. And Kanai was like the number one boy in their class, and Chiba was the number two. Right. So Chiba came into the first day of preschool like, I'm going to be the head boy, but he wasn't, because Kanai was there. And when he tells the story, he say, well, I didn't know Kanai would be there. Like, you know,
right.
So they're training in judo together for years, and they make a blood oath to always train in judo together. But then they find out about Aikido, and they're like, oh, forget judo. And they go to Aikido, and they're training in Aikido together for all these years. And it's Chiba and Kanai, and they're just like tight buddies all their lives. Of course, they have fallings out because they're dynamic people. And at a certain point when I was training with Chiba, I had been really convinced that his way of doing things was the way. And then towards the end of my time with him, he said, well, maybe now you're ready to train with Kanai. And I was just like, wait, what? Mm-hmm. I thought I was doing it the right way, and Kanai does it so differently. I just couldn't understand how could this be? And then a couple of years later, I was on the East Coast. All my training with Chiba was in California. I was on the East Coast, and I watched an Aikido demonstration that Kanai gave. And I think I've told you this story, but so I'm watching Kanai do this demonstration. There's 300 people on the mat. It's this big thing. And many masters were doing demonstrations that day. And I was sort of fresh off my training with Chiba. I was maybe like a 4th degree black belt or something at the time. And I wasn't even on the mat. I was standing up in this balcony watching down at these masters doing their things. And there were a lot of great demonstrations. And Kanai Sensei got up and he said, his English wasn't as good as his English was fine, but he was kind of shy about it. He was a sort of shy and unassuming person in a funny way for someone who was so potent. And he said, some people do Aikido this way. And he proceeded to do a demonstration of Aikido where he did just absolutely to a T perfect Chiba Aikido. I was like, I was like, wait, what? I thought he didn't do it that way because I thought Chiba was the only one who could do it his way. And, he does perfect Chiba Aikido. And they say, and then some people do it this way. And he proceeds to do another master. He said, and some people do it. And he does these just impeccable, perfect versions. And he says, but I do it this way.
Right.
And then he shows his way of doing the technique. And I was just getting chills up and down my spine watching this guy, this master that I had grown up sort of thinking he was like, maybe he was the second best, And he just blew my mind and totally my whole idea of like doing things the right way. Now, there's something I think really useful about learning a very particular, like I think there is something very beneficial about spending a certain amount of time just like doing it a certain way, having a certain set of principles, following a certain set of rules, and really sort of training yourself on one way. But it's always only a way of getting to some place where you can throw the rules in the garbage. Yeah. So I think there's a benefit to the way that you were trained, which is that you're sort of figuring out your own way based on seeing many, many different examples. And then there's a benefit, also a different benefit of doing it sort of the way that I was doing it, which is sort of like thinking that there was only this one way that one must do. And hopefully we both come to a place, Yeah, go ahead.
I think there has to be almost that rigidity of learning for a while if you're going to have a realization and go, oh my God, it can be a different way. Right? Because if you're always fluid, there's no newness, right? It's all fluidity.
Yeah.
I had one of the teachers at New York Aikikai who passed away recently, Donovan Waite. We had a very interesting talk one time, and when he was learning, he studied under most of these, legends.
Broad and deep exposure to a lot of different teachers.
And we were talking about, the idea of noticing what's different versus noticing what's the same. And Donovan said that what he was very interested in is what's the thread that makes it all work. So he said, like for him, it was like a Zen koan. He's like, what this guy is doing is so different than what this guy is doing, but they both work. It's not like he was saying this is the correct way. He's like, no, there's something that's working in both. And what's that thread that I can learn from? Donovan used to drive me crazy because he was somebody that I really felt, he was the guy you wanted to learn from in a way. He was like, he was very charismatic. Like he was just beautiful Aikido. And I remember we were doing this thing, Kokyu Dosa, which is a ritual that we do. And he said, you're going to raise your arms and then you're going to turn and then you're going to direct the person. So it's raise the arms, turn, and direct the person. He said, you never raise and turn at the same time. He kind of separated those moments. So I spent all this time learning that. And then 6 months later, he taught it the other way. He said, no, you never do that and then do that. You always do it at the same time. And he was so convinced of both. And I don't know if he was just messing with us, but it created a lot of cognitive dissonance for me. And it made me realize like, you know what, I'm going to have to draw my own conclusion at a certain point. I'm going to study one. I want to know if I can do both. and what they do, and that,
Yeah.
I think that's where learning really starts. It's like, oh, how does this behave?
Well, and that connects very much to a sort of an idea that you find in practically all Feldenkrais lessons, which is this idea that, you do a particular movement, and maybe there's one element of the movement, like does the hip move forward when the shoulder moves forward, say,
Mm-hmm.
and people say, oh, well, is it supposed to?
Yeah. What's the right way?
What's the right way? Just tell me the right way to do it. And I'm sure I can do it the right way if you just tell me what the right way is. But that's never what happens in a Feldenkrais lesson. What happens instead is you do the movement and you see if you can find a way of doing it where the hip doesn't move. And then you see, can you find a way of doing it where the hip does move? And this and probably maybe you do it where the hip moves in the opposite direction, where you do it where something else entirely different happens. And the really interesting thing I think about this is that when you explore those various options, your nervous system finds a kind of new equilibrium that there's just more options available. But it's sort of that coming to a new equilibrium that is it's not something that you consciously do. It's something that is just kind of a built-in feature of the nervous system, that when presented with these various options, the system is able to come to a new sort of organization and isn't any longer just sort of stuck doing the same habitual rut that it has always done, whether it's moving the hip forward or not moving the hip forward, or whatever the habitual thing is, you've sort of opened up this possibility. And I think to circle us back to this idea of calming the nervous system or relaxing, I think one of the things that, you can say to somebody, just relax, like just sit there and just relax. Right. And to some extent, we're able to do that. Okay, well, I'll sit up a little straighter and I'll get my shoulders in a better, and I'll just kind of take a deep breath. Okay. Now I'm relaxed. I'm as relaxed as I can get and still be sitting up and talking to you. But as I sit here, I'm still enacting a tremendous amount of there's a lot of muscular contraction in my system that I don't have the conscious control over to be able to just stop doing it. It's so deeply habitual. It's just a built-in aspect of the way that I function. And so and what happens over time, especially, over the course of a day, a stressful day, but over the course of years and decades, those sort of habitual muscular contractions, they just sort of accumulate. They build up, and we can't just consciously drop them. They're not amenable to our attempts to just like try to just be aware of the tension in your neck and drop it. Well, you can do that a little bit, but there's a tremendous amount of muscular contraction that is officially part of the intentional musculature, right? It's not like the movement of your intestines and peristalsis. It's like your intentional skeletal musculature, and yet you can't stop contracting it if you want to. But what happens in a
tied into our
lesson,
thinking about it also. Sorry.
Say that again.
Maybe this is an aside, but it's also tied to our thinking about how we hold our body.
It's tied to all kinds of things. It's tied to your memories of why did I start contracting my stomach that way? It was probably because I was a little pudgy when I was in 7th grade, and I didn't want the girls to see my, just whatever it is. You get these things, and you develop these habits, and they just become embedded. But when you start to explore these different movement options in a Feldenkrais lesson, it very much allows for the possibility of those deeply habitual things to be dropped, so that they drop, they reduce. You didn't consciously just say, oh, this muscle, I'm going to soften it. But over the course of an exploration of movement of that kind, a lot of that drops away. And so what you end up with at the end of a session is you end up with this feeling of like,
Oh my
oh
God.
God, I'm so much more relaxed than I ever usually am. How did I get here? Like, how did I even, I wish I could just get this way at a drop of a hat. And over time, I think you actually can learn so that you have more awareness and you can do that. But I think that's sort of the circle back to the idea of dropping, or the idea of relaxing, and, it's calming the nervous system in this
Yeah, and
very direct sort of neuromuscular way.
I often think about, I like thinking about how do you get home to your house or to your apartment, right? And at least in the beginning, very often we get home one way, right? It's like, well, I'm there and I'm going to follow whatever path that my phone told me or somebody told me. And like a neural pathway, we're going to keep reinforcing that. And there's a feeling and a freedom in that. Like, as long as I'm on this path, I'm going to get home and I can feel good about that. And then one day you have to go out of your way. You go to a different restaurant or something, and there might be a little nervousness, but it's like, okay, I'm going home a different way. And then it's like, okay, I'll learn that. And now I have two. Like, I have two or three paths from, say, Chinatown to my apartment. If you do it enough, I think you start to develop an intuition for finding your way home and for exploring, which is a different sort of order. It's not just adding one way of
Yeah.
doing it or another, but you get that sense. Maybe that's the thread that Donovan is talking about.
Well,
You
I
get a
think you're
sense of,
saying something, you're saying something that I think is extremely profound, because I think what happens is when you do that sort of thing, it gets so that the very act of finding a new way and exploring becomes home. That becomes where you feel comfortable. It's like this a meta level, so that just being in that exploratory mode, or being doing those different taking those different routes, becomes something that just feels like you. It just feels like
getting comfortable with newness.
getting comfortable with newness. And that's so at a certain point, you need you just need to know how to get back to where the food is, right? Like, on just a deeply biological level, you need to get back to your refrigerator. You need to get back to the warmth of your apartment. Like, you need to know the way home. And so the safest thing on some level is having that very deeply ingrained pathway that's just like, this is my way home.
This will
And I
work.
know it.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is going to work, come hell or high water. And yet I think something can happen in human development where you get to a place where you feel like, actually, I'm going to be okay. Like, I don't have to get to that refrigerator. I know how to find food elsewhere. I know how to find the sustenance I need. And part of that sustenance is actually the exploration. And it's just a reiteration of what you were just saying. And I just want to point out how profound it is. I think it's really a profound idea.
Mm.
And it's an idea that's embedded in the sort of the methods of all these things that we're talking about, the Feldenkrais work and NLP, to the extent that I understand it. And I think, improvisation, like, I think there's a very
Yes,
clear analogy between that and improvising, right? In music, or in anything else. So,
absolutely. And that same idea of getting comfortable with newness, getting comfortable with novelty, because I think it's so easy for our nervous system to associate novelty with danger. And I think we're set up that way, right?
yeah.
And there have been times where it's like, oh, I'm going to go to a new city, and most people wouldn't believe this about me because I travel a lot. But when I'm going to a new city, it is akin to terror initially. It's like, oh my God, what if they don't have my coffee shop, right? Or what if they don't have this, or I don't know how to use the currency? Like, it's a very primal nervousness. But
Yeah.
little by little, as I've gone to new cities, I'm starting to just get a confidence. It's like, oh, I can get comfortable in a new city. I'm getting comfortable with the newness in that realm.
Yeah. It's like the difference between, okay, now I'm comfortable with London, Like I can be home or I can be in London and I'm comfortable in either place, and being comfortable with getting to be comfortable in a new place. Right.
Yeah.
It's like that's the sort of meta jump. And it sounds like, it sounds to me like that's what's happening with your traveling. And I think that, there's it's not just an analogy. It's also on some level, I think it's really just the way we
It's
learn and the
literal.
way the nervous system
Yeah.
functions. That by doing these things in say a Feldenkrais lesson on the floor, where you're exploring different pathways of movement and different options of movement that all do have a functional relationship to each other. So it's not just like blah, open exploration of any
Right.
anything goes, like do whatever you want. There is a structure there, in the same way that a city has a structure, and you have to learn, like, once the central district is here, and but this is the part you want to not go to, and this is the part that you want to make sure you go to, and so there's a structure there. And finding that way, or finding your way around, is the when you do it in one domain, I think the tendency to do that then sort of can be generalized, right? And so I think that there's a very strong, it's not just that these things relate to each other sort of like, oh, well, this is analogous to this, but you are actually becoming someone who's more capable of making those different choices in other domains when you practice doing it on the Aikido mat, or in a Feldenkrais lesson, or in your life with the guidance of somebody who knows how to use NLP as a tool for that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So what you learn in one domain can very much carry over. One of the things that I'm very interested in about your work, that I feel like I'm less versed in my work, is actually, coming up with ways of helping people to make that leap in generalization. That I think there's a lot of that kind of thing that's sort of built in to NLP. And I often feel myself, I'll do a Feldenkrais session with someone, and it may be very deep and very profound, but then I feel like I send them out the door, and all the dangers of the real world, all the risks and all the stresses of the real world are going to just tend to push them back toward their sort of habitual mode. And and this is something you and I have talked about to some extent before, just this idea of how do you help with the transition between what happens on the mat, as a kind of a metaphor, and what happens in the real world. How do you carry those things from one place to the other? And from what I know of Erickson, he seemed to do that in ways where he was really working to access the subconscious mind's ability to make that kind of a leap. And he would do it with all kinds of interesting hypnotic suggestions that would seem to be different from one moment to the next, and different from one person to the next, and from one moment to the next. So it becomes a very challenging thing to learn how to do, for lack of having a set of principles or rules or structures that are obvious. So I don't know. I'm curious what you would have to say about that.
Well, as we've discussed, it's a very rich topic, and
yeah,
I'll sort of contrast two different approaches. And the topic is really, how does somebody generalize learning kind of to a next level? It's like, oh, I got this math problem right. This multiplying fractions. Oh, got that right. And at a certain point, you start to feel like, okay, I can do this whole domain now. Right? So one way that one approach at addressing that in NLP is an idea they called future pacing. And future pacing is basically having somebody mentally rehearse doing the behavior in another context. The way this came up was when they were modeling therapists, there was this phenomena that you're talking about, that very often somebody would have kind of an aha, or be in a very powerful state in the therapist's office or in the classroom. But when they were out in the wild again, that state stayed in the room. And then the funny thing is, they would, this is called state dependent learning. they would go back to the office. And this happens to me sometimes when I go for Feldenkrais sessions. I get back in the room and I'm like, oh yeah, this is what we discovered last week, because I've made this mental association with that particular configuration of my nervous system and that geographic location. So with future pacing, you basically say to the person, notice this thing that you're feeling, notice the state, what your thinking is like. Now, when might be the next time that it might be useful to use this? So it's like, oh, I'm going to be teaching a class next week. That would be useful. Okay, so take a moment and step into that. And you're inviting them to bring that state into that imagination of being in a different room. Now, it's only their imagination, but the idea is if you have them go through 3, 5, or a dozen examples, at a certain point, they may begin to generalize that understanding. So that's one approach. And I will say, in my experience, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I'll also say, and I'm going to sound a little critical here, I've seen certain people in the NLP community believe that it had worked. And I was like, I just knew down deep, I was like, no, that's not, it didn't, I don't see evidence of it generalizing. So I always take, when I'm working with someone, including myself, I take behavioral evidence. If I get somebody to the point where they feel empowered, say, to write a resume, like we do some work and they're like, oh yeah, like I really feel like I can do a great resume now. Then I check in the next week and I say, oh, I'm curious, did you sit down any resumes this week? And they're like, oh no, I didn't. Yeah. Okay. So then I'm actually going to do it with them again. I'm kind of old school with this. I'll do it with them again. And then I'll say, oh, did you send out a resume, or did you organize your to-do list? And nope, I didn't again. Okay, let's do that again. And I feel like part of my job is starting the lawnmower engine. Like every week, I'm going to sort of light up that neurology until what will happen is finally they'll come in and they'll say, oh, when I was putting together my resume or my to-do list today, this happened. And then I know, okay, now they've taken over that bit of functioning that I was helping them do.
This is one of those areas, this is one of those sort of, sometimes you have this question. It's like there's safety, like we were talking about at the beginning, the safe environment in which to explore and in which to
there's safety, right? And there's just familiarity also, right?
Yeah. But then there's also being a hard ass and being old school, right? So there's like holding people to account, and things like that. And it's like, all right, well, there's a little cognitive dissonance created between the ideas of like safety on the one hand, but then also like being held to account on the other hand. It's like, did you do your homework kind of thing? And not that that's a problem. It's just that I think as a practitioner of any of these things, trying to use these methods to help others in some way, we have to be able to do both, right? We have to be able to create safety, but also have there be some amount of accountability. And I think,
yeah. Sorry, I would just say, I think accountability we can take as a completely different topic or mechanism. And what I just want to say, what I was talking about, where I'm checking in with them, just like, hey, I'm curious. Not like, did you do what you said you were going to do? Because that's a different thing. And that's a powerful tool. Accountability is really powerful in coaching, right? It's like, where you're exercising somebody's ability to do what they say they're going to do. But I would say that's a different topic. This is more, I'm just checking with them. It's best when I can check without even asking them.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a way that I can just sort of get a sense of like, oh yeah, I sent out some resumes.
What I find in that situation is that, if I'm really hitting the nail on the head with giving somebody something to think about or something to do later or something to that all right, we've worked on this and now go take it and apply it. if I have to ask, it's probably not, they probably didn't do it, right? Because usually what will happen for me is that someone will come back to my office and so okay, and they're anxious to tell me about the thing. So kind of like just as you were saying, it's best if you can do it without it even feeling like a check-in. And I think the easiest, the sort of like the best version of that is that the person sort of excitedly comes to tell you about their results or what they found.
Yeah, and part of the art is, can you check in without making the person feel like they're being shamed if they didn't do it? Like I'm really just curious, like, well, I'm curious, how did that go? Did you very often I'll say, did you have an opportunity to explore that?
Right. That's a great way of putting it.
Right. And some people say, no, actually I didn't, I hope to this week, and
right.
And that's when I'll sort of kind of tune up. Let's go through a quick example right now and then on to something else. But I do find that at a certain point, they'll just say, okay, Rob, we've done my to-do list so many times. I don't need you here with me doing it anymore.
Right.
That
is something I no longer need help with that.
Yeah.
That's terrific. But I also think that to some extent, you just using the relationship that you have with the person in your position, and to some extent you have a position of authority when you're working with somebody, and you can use that in advantageous ways. And, one of the things when I was a student, an academic student, I realized at a certain point, even not during the time that I was a student, I realized it later, actually, that one of the really big motivators for me in academics was just wanting my professors to think I had done a good job. Like really wanting that, like wanting to impress that specific person. Like I had this great political science advisor who was a notoriously hard grader, and a lot of people avoided his class because everybody at the school I went to was used to getting A's all the time, and if they went to his class, they wouldn't get an A usually. They'd be lucky to get a B. So, but most people didn't take his class. But I loved he was brilliant, and I loved him. I loved working with him, and wanting to impress him was such a big motivator that I did some of the best work I ever did in school for him. And, I look back at that and I think, well, it would be better if I were motivated like for my own internal reasons on some, right? It would be
and those are two very different types of motivation, and that will work very well for someone like yourself.
Yeah. Right.
And even for someone like yourself, if it's the wrong teacher, you're probably like having trouble paying attention, because if you feel like that teacher doesn't have something to offer you. Now, Absolutely. If you're somebody who's more internally driven, that won't work for either, unless they want to take on the challenge.
That's right. And that's my oldest daughter, who just graduated from college. And all through college, she struggled, and I say, well, don't you want to like do it? She would sort of struggle with this idea of like, she didn't care what the professors thought of her, which I found incredibly impressive. I was so impressed with her that she wanted them. I mean, it wasn't like she just blew them off. She had relationships with her professors, but on some level, she didn't care what they thought of her performance. And I was really impressed with that. And yet she didn't have that as a source of motivation. So it was, she amazing. Had to find motivation in other ways.
Yeah. And I would say with a very kind of fundamental pattern like that, which in NLP, we call that having an internal frame of reference versus an external frame of reference.
Yeah.
And my recommendation is just notice which one the person tends towards, and really, key into that. Like with your daughter, if you said, you should really do this because, the professor is going to think it's great. She's going to be like, whatever.
What do I care?
You should really do this because I think you may find it quite interesting. That's directing it to her own internal frame of reference. Right.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And I think I kind of stumbled upon that to some extent toward the end of her time in college. I would say, well, how do you want to feel about what you do? How do you want to feel about your work? She
Mm.
said, well, I want to do something that I'm proud of. Yeah, all right, well, so
And she went to what school?
she went to Antioch in Ohio.
Oh, okay. For some reason, I was thinking Hampshire, and I was like, "Oh, Hampshire that's perfect for her." Like, I don't know if you
Yeah,
know
well, Antioch
Hampshire. You
is
design your own curriculum, and so
yeah, Antioch is pretty Hampshire-y. It's a very
okay,
Hampshire-y kind of a
yeah.
place. Um, so yeah.
So I think this would be a good place for us to pause,
Okay.
and perhaps we can look at a follow-on, because I think we did a pretty good job of exploring this idea of safety and calm, or we started opening up some of those, and then many threads about learning and kind of the implication of that. We didn't really get to, in an explicit way, to the ahas too much, although uh, they're sort of sprinkled around that calm landscape, I would say. So, but thank you for joining me for this chat. And
Yeah, well, I hope we do it. I hope we do it again. It was really my pleasure. Thank you.
great. All right. Thanks, Josh.
All right.